low-income Tibetan families are rejecting the $120 each that is being doled out to them by your subordinates to buy Chinese firecrackers for Tibetan New Year this year? Or why further attempts to tempt the 2.8 million Tibetans with marathon television performances going on for 4 hours, trying to show happy Tibetans living in so-called, quote-unquote, normal life, has fallen on deaf ears? If there truly is democratic reform, as you say, Mr. Hu, in Tibet, can you tell me why a 30-year-old Tibetan monk in Lithang and 21 other Tibetans were detained and some badly beaten when they shouted, "No Losar this year"? What kind of democratic reform are you referring to when your government dictates what Tibetans can and cannot celebrate or wear on their bodies? What kind of democratic reform are you referring to where your government mandates what goes on within the walls of a Tibetan home or monastery? What kind of democracy are you referring to where Tibetans on the Tibetan plateau risk arrest, torture, and sometimes death for having a picture of the Dalai Lama on their shrines, or where they have to denounce the Dalai Lama? You know that that is like commanding a Catholic to denounce the Pope, or a Muslim to denounce Prophet Muhammad. Where is the democracy, I ask you, Mr. Hu, in being jumped by plainclothes public security officers at the mere slogan, "Long live the Dalai Lama," chanted by Tibetans inside Tibet? And finally, Mr. Hu, if in 50 years your leadership has failed miserably in creating democratic reform inside Tibet, looks to me like it is your leadership that really needs the democratic reform and emancipation first. As India's Mahatma Gandhi once said, "Be the change you want to see." So, Premier Hu Jintao and leaders of China, if you genuinely desire a democratic reform in Tibet, then let us see genuine democracy that honors the rights of the people, in this case Tibetans inside Tibet, to determine the future of Tibet. That would be the step in the right direction, Mr. Hu, a step China's leadership has still not learned to take in 50 years. Think about that. As your own leader Mao once said, and I quote him, "Weapons are an important factor in war, but not the decisive factor. It is people, not things, that are decisive. The contest of strength is not only a contest of military and economic power, but also the contest of human power and morale. Long live the Dalai Lama! Pray Gello! Free Tibet! So, we are gathered here, members of the Tibetan Bay Area community, instead of the usual Tibetan New Year, which we call Losar, celebrations. This year we are all joining in a global grassroots movement to express our resistance towards the Chinese oppression in Tibet. Everything that is going to be said here today, and even in the feelings that come across in our silence on this very auspicious day, usually in our calendar, it's one of the days that is most celebrated, as we all know. We have chosen to not celebrate Losar this year. And it's not because this was planned from outside a few Tibetans, but by word of mouth from inside Tibet. On this occasion, I have a message for the leadership of China, and I'm going to read you a letter that I wrote to Premier Hu Jintao. My name is Dechen Tsering, and I join millions of Tibetans in not celebrating the Tibetan New Year, Losar, today, as an act of defiance against Chinese government's occupation of Tibet, and showing my steadfast solidarity with Tibetan sisters and brothers inside Tibet. Instead of the usual New Year card, here is a letter for Mr. Hu Jintao. I call it a Losar message for who? Premier Hu Jintao, with the Chinese New Year having just passed, it is difficult for us as Tibetans to wish you Happy New Year, given the destruction you have led and condoned in Tibet, particularly since last March. It is clear from the buildup of military across the Tibetan plateau that you and your comrades are angered by the refusal of Tibetans to not be bribed into celebrating New Year with you. Your Strike Hard campaign that started on January 18, 2009, attempted to head off trouble, but in fact, the campaign of conducting house-to-house searches, arrests of Tibetans without any evidence of wrongdoing, monitoring internet cafes and cell phones for information that you consider a danger to state security, have done nothing but cut deeper into the gaping wounds of last March. No doubt you and your comrades wanted Tibetans to celebrate New Year alongside with the Chinese New Year, so that you could showcase what a harmonious society you have established inside Tibet to the world. Take a 53-year-old man in a village in Gansu province who recounts how security forces came in January to his village and tried to enforce celebrations by a system of collective responsibility. I quote here, 10 days before Chinese New Year, the police came and divided us into groups of 20 families and put 1 or 2 people in charge. They were given a few thousand yuan and told they were responsible for ensuring Tibetans will celebrate. That they would be punished if there were no celebrations, he explained. Later they came and arrested 9 people who they said were ringleaders in the refusal campaign, even though they, the 9 people, had nothing to do with it. End quote. The attempts by the Chinese authorities to force Tibetans to move forward our New Year to coincide with the Chinese New Year celebrations has sparked a grassroots movement that has gone global. Our movement is to boycott festive celebrations during the Tibetan New Year and use the occasion to mourn our sisters and brothers whom your paramilitary have killed since last March. If you are tempted to resort to the same old response that a handful of Tibetan splitters are doing this, and that it is the quote-unquote Dalai clique that instigated this, please think again, Mr. Hu. The movement began inside Tibet, and you have no one to blame except the historical failure of your government in handling the dissent inside Tibet. As one Tibet scholar I respect says, China is suffering from a crisis of governance inside Tibet. As one fellow Tibetan inside Tibet put it plainly today, we didn't celebrate anything this year because we have nothing to celebrate. Your policies inside my homeland this past year have caused hundreds of deaths, thousands of arrests, torture, detentions, not to mention the countless who are still missing after being detained by Chinese police. Even as I write you this letter, which I have no idea if you will read, but many others I hope will, thousands of Chinese paramilitary with loaded weapons are moving into various towns and cities of Tibet to increase your repressive policies of a lockdown in the Tibetan plateau, while media and tourism inside Tibet are banned until April 1st, 2009. According to the One Times online article on February 20th, 2009, and I quote, columns of army vehicles have been seen clogging narrow mountain roads into Tibetan population